Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of GeoSpace. I'm Mohammed Saleh, your host. Really glad you could join us today. GeoSpace is a new series of live conversations right here on X, where we dive into the fast changing world of Middle Eastern geopolitics, from shifting power dynamics and regional rivalries to the big picture policies of global actors like the US, Russia, China, and Europe. We are live every 2 weeks, and each episode will either be a one on one expert conversation or a wider panel discussion. After the live show, each episode will be repackaged as a podcast and published on the New Regions website under the Watch section, as well as on our YouTube and SoundCloud channels, usually by the end of the following day. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by Afshon Ostovar to talk about the ongoing US Iran talks. Over the past few weeks, there have been two rounds of indirect or direct negotiations, depending on whose word you take. First in Muscat in Oman, and then in Rome, Italy, both mediated by Omani Foreign Minister Badr bin Hamad Al Busaidi. Afshan is an associate professor of national security affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School in California and a non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, where we are actually colleagues. He brings over a decade of experience in U.S. defense and Middle Eastern policy and Iran. He is the author of the award winning book Vanguard of the Imam Religion, Politics, and Iran's Revolutionary Guards. And more recently, in 2024, another excellent book, Wars of Ambition, the United States, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East. Just a note that he's here speaking in a personal capacity, and the views he articulates here reflect his own solely and not the institutions that he's affiliated with. A quick heads up, we will go for about an hour, roughly 45 minutes or so of discussion. Then we will take your questions. Either via mic request or as written replies to this tweet or post. Thanks again for tuning in. Afshan, welcome to GeoSpace.
Thanks for having me.
Let's jump right in. Back in 2019, you wrote in Foreign Affairs that the US, and I'm quoting here, that the US and Iran are marching toward war. 6 years later, after that article, we are seeing both military buildup, including deployments to the Gulf region and as far as Diego Garcia base in the Indian Ocean, as well as parallel negotiations unfolding. At this point, do you think are we headed more toward a deal or a military clash of some sort?
Personally, I'm more optimistic about a deal. I think both sides seem to be more inclined towards a diplomatic solution. The Iranians, in particular, I think have been incentivized for various reasons. We can talk about that to treat diplomacy with the Trump administration much differently this time than they did during the previous Trump presidency. So I think they're more keen on trying to resolve things without a clash. And frankly, I think for within the White House, within let's say the broader Trump administration, um, there's a plurality of views. But I think one of the views that's perhaps gaining ascendancy right now is one in which military restraint is encouraged, and I think particularly in the Middle East. And I think for those folks within the administration, they'd much rather see a diplomatic end to this standoff rather than a military escalation.
Right. It's also really interesting that President Donald Trump has emerged as an unlikely advocate for a deal with Iran. He talked tough in his election campaign against Iran, but he also kept the door open to negotiations and a deal, to be fair. And now, even after reinstating the maximum pressure campaign and issuing that harsh maximum pressure February memo, he seems to be really quite seriously pursuing talks at this point. What do you think he's actually aiming for here?
I think he's aiming for a deal. I think that's what he wanted even in his first presidency, and I think that's what he wants now. It's the people that surrounded him in his first presidency are different than those who are surrounding him now. I think he has more space within his administration for, let's say, voices of caution to emerge, uh, and and so I've never really seen him as somebody who wanted to deal with Iran in a military way. I mean, if you go back to his first administration, while there are things that the administration does, like the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, for instance,
Hmm.
there are other times where the administration chooses not to escalate against Iran. In fact, I think if we just look at the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, Iran's response, which was a major missile attack against U.S. forces in Iraq, the fact that we didn't respond to that, we being the United States, with military force, I think, was indicative of the president's cautiousness and in using and deploying military power. So I've always seen him as someone who's more inclined towards diplomacy than conflict. I just think that the way that he goes about it is perhaps counterintuitive to some of those who are standing on the outside, who see sort of both the tough talk and the tough soft measures like sanctions. But those are always matched by a real openness to dialogue. I mean, even now, within the last couple of days, the president has talked about, wanting Iran to be a great country, live its best life, and all these kinds of things. And this is quite different, I think, from the way that past presidents have talked about Iran. Even in the heady days of the JCPOA with the Obama administration, the sort of enthusiasm for what Iran could be, I think, was muted, even if it was also part of the policy. So yeah, I see him as somebody who is much more interested in making diplomatic deals than using military power.
We'll get to the content of the negotiations and a possible deal in a minute, but speaking of the composition of the Trump administration, we know that there are both so-called isolationists and interventionists within his administration. Which one of these two camps is steering the ship right now, especially when it comes to the question of negotiations and dealing with Iran?
I mean, the only answer I can give you is I have no idea. I don't know steering the ship here. I can only sort of see it from the outside, like everybody else. But the way that the sense that I get from looking from the outside is that those voices that are more inclined towards a diplomatic solution, and less inclined towards using military means to end Iran's nuclear program seem to be like leading the chauffeur. That's the way that I see it.
Right. And just to add to that, we have this, and I also mentioned it, this interventionist versus isolationist binary that has become sort of a dominant lens for people who are trying to make sense of the administration's policies. But this binary even really helpful here? And I'd like to, offer an example. Steve Bannon, who, a lot of people might actually consider to be an isolationist, in his War Room podcast a few days ago, he called for total economic warfare to crush Iran's oil exports, and he brought up this notion of economic warfare as a way of trying to bring Iran to its knees, and as a way of trying to basically torpedo the relationship between Iran and China. And given the fact that Iran is one of the important providers of Chinese oil, given this kind of tone and language, I mean, does thinking in terms of interventionist versus isolationist really make much of a sense? I mean, someone like Bannon doesn't like the idea of military campaigns in the Middle East or elsewhere for that matter. But, here he is out, publicly calling for economic warfare against Iran, and also knowing full well that, to enforce that kind of warfare, the U.S. needs to deploy or have a substantial military deployment and presence in the Persian Gulf or the Indian Ocean regions.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to pin down the administration's current policy trajectory based on statements of those inside the administration, besides the president himself, or sometimes even including the president himself, but certainly also the people that might be within the wider scope of influence. It's how would I explain it? I think this administration is far harder to peg down in terms in usual, let's say, political science terms, geopolitical terms, or even policy terms, particularly
Mhm.
because the president is sui generis, and he has a way of conducting business that's not usual in the way that politics is usually run by presidents. And I think this makes it difficult to just peg it down, because some people within the administration have had, pretty strong views on Iran, let's say, and you can historically look back at their statements on Iran and their positions in Iran. But a lot of those, seem to be willing to evolve, as the president evolves with his positions. And so it's difficult to know, even if, let's say member X of the administration believes, that a more hawkish approach towards Iran is the right way to go. If they're not really going to stand up and advocate that in an outward way, that is to say, to challenge the president, then it's not clear if those voices really matter ultimately in the discussion. I think what matters here is the president, and the way that I view this president based on his previous presidency, is that he is very disinclined to enter into new conflict, period, but especially so in the Middle East. And while it's I think easy to use soft measures, economic warfare sounds tough, but at the end of the day, it's sanctions or tariffs, right? And these things can be deployed and they can be used, but in the previous iteration of the Trump administration, when these things, pushed um, Iran into acting out in a aggressive way, we generally didn't meet aggression with aggression. That is to say, we didn't challenge Iran's military aggression with military aggression of our own. There were some instances of it, but by and large, we didn't. Um, and I think today it's even more precarious in the Middle East, because so much more emphasis is being put on focusing on China. And if you look at some of the new people that have come into the Pentagon, for example, like Undersecretary Elbridge Colby, um, you know, Iran has never been a focus for people like that. And war in the Middle East has never been a focus for people like that. And they've all wanted to disengage, putting resources or limit the resources that we put in the Middle East so that we can redouble our efforts in in the South China Sea So yeah, I think it's difficult to take the words of those around Trump to really understand his policy. I think if you see the president himself and decisions that he made in the past, the president is looking more similar than different.
Hmm. I think you're right on the money there. And one thing that we have seen President Trump also say over and over, even before his first term and during the first term, is that he tries to be unpredictable, right? He tries to use unpredictability in some ways also really as a strategic tool within his sort of governance kit. So that is something important to keep in mind as well. But let's get into the specifics of what is being negotiated right now. Is it just the nuclear program, as far as we know, which seems to be the case, at least judging from the media statements? Or are the missiles, the Iranian missile program and Iran's network of regional militias and proxies also on the table in the current talks between Iran and the US?
From Iran's perspective, it's the Iranian leadership has been emphatic that this is only about the nuclear program and that it will only ever be about the nuclear program. The Iranian leaders have been emphatic about other things that they've walked back. For example, the supreme leader was adamant that there'd be no talks under maximum pressure, and here we are, having talks under maximum pressure. So those things can change, but it seems to me that the Iranians are probably pretty serious about not wanting to stand the pressure of these talks beyond the issue of nuclear enrichment. The Iranians don't want to give up their program. They don't want to give up their a lot of their advances. I think they're willing to limit things. Might be willing um, to send out some of their or all of their highly enriched uranium to perhaps Russia as a safeguard for the deal. But the Iranians, at least right now, are adamant that it's just about the nuclear program. U.S. officials in the past, not necessarily this week, but in the past, have always wanted to expand the aperture of the deal to include missiles and proxies in particular. Um, but it's not clear to me that those things are being discussed at the moment, and I don't know if they'll ultimately be discussed at all. What seems to be being discussed right now is just confidence building measures that Iran can take in order to get some sort of sanctions relief as sort of a first step towards a broader deal.
Right. The U.S. Presidential envoy Steve Witkoff, recently and most recently on April 15th, actually, he told Fox News that the U.S. wants verification on weaponization, including missiles and bomb triggers. This doesn't seem to be an idea that Iran wants to be included, at least the missile part. And the statement that came out following the April 19 talks in Rome was actually quite positive. And judging from the positiveness of that, is it fair to say that despite Witkoff's media statements, the U.S. Actually backed off on missile demands, and did not bring up that issue during the meeting? Otherwise, the meeting would have not proceeded so positively, and an agreement to continue further talks, especially at the expert level, would have not possibly, been reached so easily.
Yeah, I don't exactly know how they came to this point. I suspect that there are those within the administration that, um, while taking Iran's missiles and proxies seriously, um, want to isolate the issue more towards the nuclear issue because the nuclear issue is one that there's a track record for being able to deal with. That is to say, the JCPOA, or the first nuclear deal, right? They know that Iran can limit its program, and they know that they can get back to something like that. Whereas when you're dealing with missiles and proxies, it's much squishier, and it's much more difficult to negotiate. And for Iran, it becomes much more maximalist. If you ask Iran to compromise on every front of its sort of strategic deterrent, then Iran will essentially be giving up everything it has in exchange for something else. And while Iran might ultimately decide to go that way, if whatever's being offered is sufficiently attractive, I suspect that they won't, because things like missiles and proxies are how Iran developed its approach towards strategy, precisely from in response to historical experience, particularly the Iran-Iraq War, and the 2003 sort of invasion of Iraq. This is where sort of Iran's main strategic programs emanate out of. So I don't think they would want to compromise on those things. But there may be areas where compromise could be found. Iran could be, let's say, transparent about its past work on a triggering device, or on warhead development or implosion devices or things like this. And Iran could show a good faith effort to mothball those programs, or show that it has moved beyond those programs. But I think it'd be very difficult for Iran to agree to anything that would meaningfully limit its missile program or its proxies. But we can talk about proxies. I mean, there's a whole discussion there that makes the proxies, I think, a different conversation this time than in 2015, when the original nuclear deal was negotiated.
Sure. In terms of the Iranian nuclear program itself, we have heard different proposals. There are those in the U.S. administration, and Israel also supports that perspective of pursuing a Libya model, right? Dismantling the entirety of Iran's nuclear program. There are those who have mentioned a UAE model, which is focused on peaceful and civilian nuclear research and use. And there are those who are saying that the current direction of the talks, basically seem to be heading toward what, they like to call a JCPOA 2.0. Which one of these do you think we are heading toward, if an actual deal was to be agreed upon by both sides?
Well, Ali Shamkhani, who was a former secretary of Iran's National Security Council, as well as has played a number of important roles in Iran's military and within the Supreme Leader's office. He came out with a statement where he explicitly said, you know, Iran wants guarantees, it wants protection from any snapback retaliation, it wants investment, it wants a removal of sanctions. He just gives this list of all the things that Iran wants. But he also explicitly says that Iran, will not accept the Libya model or the UAE model as a solution. Um, Again, you know, he's one guy within the establishment saying one thing. That doesn't necessarily mean that what he says is the truth, or is where we'll end up. But I suspect that it reflects the truth within the administration at the moment, within the Supreme Leader's circle at the moment. The problem with the Libya model, of course, is what happened to Libya, right? Like it's the worst way to phrase um, a goal for Iran, right? Give up everything that you have, and maybe not exist in a decade after that. So the Libya model, I think, is a well-intentioned but poorly phrased sort of aim for Iran. The UAE model, I think, makes a lot more sense. But of course, you know, Iran views itself as more advanced, let's say, in the nuclear realm than the UAE, and doesn't want to feel like it's going to go back and have parity with a lesser program. And so, what Iran is going to want is something that's singular to Iran, something that cannot be called, this model or that model, but rather some sort of agreement that is branded along the lines of Iran and its compromise with the United States. But I think what we might get out of that is some return to the limits imposed by the first JCPOA, the guardrails that were there, the oversight that the IAEA led. I think we'll get a return of all of that. I think what might be sticky is what Iran does with its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. I think, and its advanced centrifuges. I think those are the two areas where Iran is going to try to extract the most leverage from the other side, but also will have to make the greatest compromise in order to get something across the table. So, yeah, I think one of the more interesting suggestions, which Iranian officials have said, no, we're not going to do that. But again, this is early days. It could happen, is if Iran were to send its stockpile of highly enriched uranium to Russia, and Russia holds it as a caretaker, with the idea that if the U.S. pulls out of the deal or whatever, that Russia could return that stockpile. I think this creates a whole slew of other complications and potential problems, both for Iran and the United States. But it's an intriguing sort of third-party solution that, of course, was around in 2015 and is coming around again, but it might make a deal more palatable or possible this time around.
Mhm. Let's flip to the Iranian side of this equation. Who is really in charge inside of Iran in terms of making the ultimate decision, on the course of these negotiations, on the outcome? Is it the supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei? Is it the IRGC? Is it the Pezeshkian government through the foreign ministry? Who is really calling the shots here?
Yes, and yes is the way that I would answer that. The supreme leader, of course, he runs the show. He has the ultimate decision, and the regime has to abide by what he says. So he's the one that's greenlighting talks at the moment, and he can, of course, pull pull Iran out of those talks. So he's the one that sets the tone and ultimately sets the policy. But he has to govern in some ways by consensus within his regime. Within the ruling regime, you have two main power sources. You have the supreme leader and you have the IRGC. And for the most part, the IRGC has been the most prominent influencer of Iranian policy, for really the last 2 decades. And up until the last year, the IRGC was, I would say, ascendant within Iran's political scene. They're still very powerful, and they're not easy to go against. But what has happened to the IRGC is that over the last year, in the IRGC's war, or Iran's war with Israel, is that much of what gave the IRGC its leverage and credibility within the regime has been compromised. The IRGC's proxies have been eviscerated in Lebanon and in Gaza. The Iranian experiment in Syria is over, and all pro-IRGC forces have either had to retreat out of Syria or are embattled within Syria. And its vaunted missile program, which was Iran's greatest standoff threat, proved to be lacking in its war with Israel. Despite firing hundreds of missiles at Israel, it was only able to land a half dozen or so, and none of them really did any significant damage. And so what that did more than anything else was kind of expose Iran's hand and really show the limitations of its military. So the IRGC, I think, is in its weakest point for at least 2 decades within the Iranian regime. That doesn't mean that it's weak, either it's at its weakest point. And this has created a little space for the government of Iran. We tend to think of the government of Iran as the whole thing. But the way that I speak about Iran is that I speak about the regime, meaning the unelected institutions of power, the supreme leader and the IRGC, and government I speak about as the elected institutions of power. And so the executive branch under President Pezeshkian usually has to follow the lead of the supreme leader and the IRGC in formulating and enacting policy. But I think at the moment, while that still remains true, the supreme leader is becoming much more open to what Pezeshkian and his foreign policy team have advocated for, which is basically to find compromise with the United States. I'd also say is not against these talks either, because they realize that they're also in a precarious position. So the regime is in sort of a unique position to be open to talks, but I think that has allowed the Pezeshkian government to gain more space within the policy discussions within the regime. And so I see them as maybe not leading the discussions in terms of or the strategy of the discussions, but certainly gain more influence within regime's larger policy debates.
It also seems to me that Afghan, the so-called conservative or principalist voices within the Iranian system are not as loud this time in opposing the talks as they used to be during the JCPOA, and especially after the first Trump administration walked out of that agreement with Iran. So, what is it that is, sort of driving this broader Iranian consensus within, the regime, the broader system, to come to the negotiating table right now? We know that, sort of anti-Americanism has been one of the ideological pillars of the Islamic Republic for the past 4.5 decades. They have been always very tough in terms of rhetoric, hostile toward the U.S. And, if that was not enough, in 2020, we had the U.S. administration kill General Qasem Soleimani of the IRGC's Quds Force. The regime also domestically seems to be at a very weak point in terms of, its economy, and it's also very much prone to protests, which we have seen several waves of since 2017. Why are we seeing this consensus right now in terms of wanting to negotiate, especially with Trump, someone who the regime really vilified a great deal, at least since 2020?
Well, you did a great job explaining the domestic considerations. What the supreme leader is ultimately in charge of, and what has ultimately been his great aim, is unsurprisingly the preservation of the Islamic system in Iran. That's his main goal. It's always been his main goal. Now, he's gone about it in ways that perhaps haven't been I don't know, wouldn't have been my choices. In terms of, he's been a much more aggressive leader than a cautious one. But his goal is the preservation of the Islamic system in Iran, and he knows the regime in Iran is not popular. The Islamic system in Iran is not popular. I mean, even the IRGC, its view is that 40% of the country are implacably against the regime. They see 40% are in favor of the regime and 20% are somewhere in the middle and can go either way. And so, from the IRGC's perspective, when they advocate for domestic policy, it's more about massaging that 20% than it is caring about the 40% who are against it. That's the IRGC's view. I would suggest that it's probably different. It's probably something like 60% are against the regime. 20% are strongly in favor of it, and a smaller percentage are in the middle. But regardless of where it is, I think everyone agrees, both outside and inside Iran, that the regime does not have a plurality of support within Iran. And so they are particularly sensitive to things that can tip the population into unrest or into rebellion. So a declining economy is bad. Conflict is bad, right? War against Iran would be bad, especially because it could create sort of an environment in which rebellion could gain steam. And instability is generally bad, right? They tried for a while
Mhm.
the Arab Spring and then the Gaza War as sort of a way to rally people around their foreign policy, but it never really. Iranians, for the most part, see the regime's foreign policy as what has bankrupted their country. They don't see it as something that's given their country pride or prestige. And so, in that sense, they sense a precariousness to their rule, and finding a way to stabilize the economy first and foremost through is a goal. But beyond that, in the past, the regime had really significant leverage with the United States, and it used that leverage in various ways. One of it was proxies. There was always the threat of missiles coming out of Gaza or missiles coming out of um, Lebanon towards Israel, or even out of Syria towards Israel, as a way to to dampen, pressure against Iran. There was Iran's own willingness to escalate militarily and use missiles against U.S. forces or against the Saudis as a way to leverage Washington. And there was also Iran's ability and willingness to target its neighbors, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, either directly or through the Houthis in Yemen, as another way of creating leverage with the United States. But things have changed. First and foremost, Iran is no longer adversaries with its areas. It's had a rapprochement with both the Saudis and the UAE. In fact, the Saudi defense minister, Khalid bin Salman, just visited Iran in the highest level Saudi delegation visited Iran in decades. Iran is increasingly close with the Emiratis, so it no longer it benefits from those relationships, and that neither the Saudis or the Emiratis are leading calls for cracking down on Iran or anything like that. But also, Iran cannot use them as targets anymore. So it no longer has those points of leverage. Iran can't threaten Israel credibly anymore. One, because Israel broke the taboo of striking Iran directly itself, and so Iran knows that anything it does against Israel will come back worse for it, and so that's no longer a real credible threat. And Iran's proxies have been mostly eviscerated. The only proxies that continue to be formidable are in Iraq, but Iraq is also precarious for different reasons, and Yemen with the Houthis. But those are not, I think, sufficient enough to give Iran much of an edge with its adversaries. So Iran is kind of in a really depleted position strategically and a depleted position economically. And I think this makes it very difficult for Iran to even if it wants to resist pressure and pushback and seek compromise from a stronger position. It really can't. And so, unless Iran wants to tempt the risk of war, it's going to have to find a way to compromise with the Trump administration. I think that's exactly what you're seeing and why.
Right. So, in other words, one could say that for the regime in Tehran, survival trumps other considerations at the moment, in particular. Getting to the regional angle of things here, you talked about, the Gulf, the improved Iranian Gulf relationship over the past several years. Given that Iran's nuclear program has been a regional flashpoint for decades, some might actually say, Israel, Gulf states, and even Turkey should welcome a deal that puts guardrails on Iran's nuclear program. Do these actors, however, do they see more risk in a deal or in a collapse of negotiations?
I think they see more risk of collapse. Well, let me divorce the Israelis from the Arabs here.
Right.
For the Arab states, Saudi and the Emiratis, I think they see more risk in a collapse of a deal, because for their part, they've settled their differences with Iran. They have found a way to work with Iran. Iran has stopped threatening them. The Houthis have stopped hitting them with uh, with missiles and drones. So they've made peace with Iran, both figuratively and literally. And I think now that they're out of Iran's crosshairs, finding some way to stabilize the region would be good. I think they're all in favor of it. This is a big difference from 2015. Um, a smaller difference between 2015 and now is Israel's position. And Israel, of course, also has a plurality within its government, but the current prime minister seems to be quite fixated on the idea that um, that the solution, and perhaps the only solution to the threat posed by Iran, is a military one. And so I think a collapse of a deal would benefit that position, uh, because it would increase the likelihood that that conflict could be um, the next option. Uh, so I think Turkey, I think, is a little more complex. Um, uh, I mean, Turkey does not favor instability in the region, generally speaking, but Turkey, as a bit of a rival, and a weaker Iran, is is a stronger Turkey, especially when you're talking about places where they interact, like Iraq, and to a lesser extent now Syria. So I don't know where Turkey's position really would be. I would suggest that they would probably be more inclined towards supporting a compromise and a diplomatic deal than war. Um, but should war happen, I think Turkey can find a way to benefit from it. If that makes sense.
Mhm. Israel, as you said, seems to be the regional actor that is most unhappy with the current negotiations with Iran, especially if the negotiations are going to be only focused on the nuclear aspect and exclude the missile program, the regional proxies. So do you see, a kind of scenario where, especially under Netanyahu, Israel, wanting to take some sort of preemptive measures and strike Iranian nuclear facilities, hoping or thinking, that the U.S. would have to stand by it if it carried out this kind of a strikes?
And I mean, that's always a possibility. And frankly, I think that's been a concern uh, for outside observers and within the U.S. government for even before the first nuclear deal. The idea that this introduced something unilaterally, and the U.S. could get sort of sucked into whatever comes after it. Um, I don't know where this will go, because the Netanyahu used to be a quite cautious leader when it came to Iran. I mean, he was always very hawkish on Iran vocally, but when it came to military or applying military power to Iran, that's where he was cautious. So he sort of talked a big game, but in terms of how he conducted Israeli policy towards Iran, he was much more in favor of covert operations. And even then, the covert operations, became in some respect much more aggressive in the short interlude when he was out of the prime minister's office. So he's not, at least historically, he's been cautious on using war against Iran as a method. But things have changed, obviously, considerably since October 7th and through the Gaza war. And if you are within Israel, you understand the Iranian threat better than anybody else. I mean, Iran has fired hundreds of ballistic missiles against Iran. The two largest ballistic missile attacks in history have been Iran's attacks against Israel, and it's only been by virtue of Israel's part in alliances with the United States and with other countries that it was able to survive those attacks. Well, in addition to its own sort of vaunted anti-air defenses, that Israel was able to survive those attacks without more missiles hitting. So I think from Israel's perspective, that the fear is likely to be there be a compromise that to actually build up its proxy networks again, find a way to re-strengthen Hezbollah, continue to work with criminal networks in Syria and Jordan to smuggle weapons into the West Bank, and continue to improve its missile and drone technology, so that in another 5 years or another 10 years, it can perhaps challenge Israel again. And so, if you're within Israel, you understand that a compromise that's limited to the nuclear issue is not going to solve the threat posed by Iran against Israel. And so I think they have good reason to want a more lasting or thorough solution to the problem. And while nuclear, or while Israel seems to be sort of what has been advocated for, I think they probably behind the scenes are also advocating for just a broader aperture in the discussions going forward. Generally, yeah, I think their perspective is both much more cautious about negotiations, and perhaps less optimistic about what compromise might ultimately mean them.
Thank you so much, Afshan, for sharing your insights and analysis with us and our audiences. See you again in 2 weeks for the next episode of GeoSpace.